well as Florida.
Yeah.
Are we
Yeah.
ready to start the meeting? The
Your meeting chair.
1 minute has gone by.
Yeah, if you're ready.
I know it's the holiday season and all. Okay, welcome everybody to the study session of the Traverse City Planning Commission, December 17th. How is everyone? Welcome to the holiday season. Do we have to take a roll call?
Yeah, I can do roll call. Okay. Commissioner Deturi?
Here.
Commissioner, sorry, Mr. Teller's name is on here. I don't know why.
Oh, yep.
Yeah. Commissioner Hershey?
Here.
Commissioner Treadwell?
Here.
Commissioner Heller?
Here.
Commissioner O'Brien?
Present.
I'm sorry, it's all screwed up. Deturi.
You already called got her.
Anderson. It's all messed up. I don't know why. I'm on the wrong meeting, I think.
It doesn't like
Sorry.
you.
I got it.
You got through
I think you got through everyone
I
who's
got it.
here.
just Jerry.
Jerry.
I
Jerry.
pulled up the wrong thing. Sorry.
Not taller.
Here's the
I
one.
mean, they both have mustaches.
Yep.
There I am.
Okay. Are we good?
I'm good.
Okay.
Yeah, I got it.
So, as always, our land acknowledgement. The land on which we gather is the territory of the Ottawa and Chippewa peoples who stewarded this land throughout the generations. Thank you for your strength and resilience in protecting this land and inspiring us to uphold our responsibilities to do the same. Are there any announcements?
Yeah, we have a couple. It's our last meeting of 2024, so with that, we will be having our little Christmas cookie party or holiday cookie party afterwards, if you have time to stick around. So moving into the new year, a couple things. Last night, the City Commission approved the allocation of ARPA funding for Safe Harbor for the next 2 years to help with their operation and moving towards a year-round shelter. They are still working on securing some other funding sources, after which they will formally submit their application for the year-round shelter, which would be a new SLUP. I spoke with the city attorney. Their current SLUP has been amended. This technically could be an amendment, but sometimes when you get far enough down the line where you've done amendment, sometimes it's just nice to start fresh with a new process. It's the same process, or new approval. Same process, whether it's a major amendment or a new one, so it's not going to be any more burdensome to them, but it just makes things cleaner moving forward. Also, last night, the City Commission approved a coastal management grant through a resolution that Leslie has been working on to help supplement the planned work along the waterfront, specifically where the 2 new bathhouses are. So this is a grant designed to help with strategies to reduce erosion and runoff. So what we will be looking at is enhancing those projects with additional plantings along the waterfront, as well as drip irrigation to help ensure that they get settled. So we appreciate the City Commission's support on that. I think it's due Friday, correct? It was a quick turnaround, so that'll be coming up still. A couple other things, CDBG proposals were received last Friday. We had the RFP out for that. It's kind of different in that this really does function more like a grant, where we have a pot of money to give out as grants. So we're going to start reviewing those. Some of the ones we received we know are not eligible right off the bat. They're not located in the city and things like that. But many of those applicants did work closely with Leslie on the creation of their proposal. So there was a lot of interaction there. And then today, the design team met with representatives from the TC Millworks, including representatives from the Airport Authority. So we, from each department, went through and talked about different perspectives and things like that. From here, they'll begin kind of more one-off meetings with specific departments to talk about like the trail and the water hookup and things like that. But we were able to provide a strong, comprehensive overview today. So moving into next year, we have, in January, some annual items that we will be addressing after the holidays. We have the election of officers that we do each year at the beginning of the year. We will have our bylaw review, which is a practice that we just do at the beginning of January. That would be a time, and of course, at any time, the Planning Commission can bring up a change to the bylaws, but we like to reserve a space for that for everyone. As well as begin discussing the establishment of the 2025 Planning Commission goals, which back this fall in September, you had some of those initial conversations with the master plan, right, with how you wanted to prioritize that. So we'll be building off of that conversation going into it. And then probably at that study session in January, we'll be presenting the planning annual report for 2024. So By law, a planning commission has to have a report submitted to the elected body summarizing activities of the year. So we will be creating that as we usually do. As a past practice, each department used to create an annual department report that then would be presented to the city commission. With all the transition over the last 2 years, we haven't really been doing that and presenting it. But about, I think it was 2 years ago, instead of doing 2 separate reports, we combined the planning commission, planning department into just one report that highlighted all of it, since we all work hand in hand on that. So Katie's been working with members on the department to pull that together, and we'll be presenting it in January. February is when you guys will transition to CIP. So the first meeting of February, the CIP will be presented to you. By law, you have to hold a public hearing to determine whether or not the CIP is consistent with the master plan. And we've talked about some of those examples, and we'll talk about that again of how things could differ in that regard. So it'll be introduced to you in February. This is the format we usually take. We would ask people that next week to submit any questions that they have, and then we try to get those answers directly from staff, because although the planning department facilitates the process, we don't create the CIP. Every department and collaborative teams that work together put those projects in there. And we're not subject matter experts on what size pipe upgrade needs to occur on the water system and things like that, but we do have those experts on staff. So if you have specific questions, what we typically do is try to get you to submit those so we can provide the answers ahead of time, and we compile them for everyone to see. And then at that study session in February, if we cannot get your questions adequately answered, we will bring the staff member that needs to be here to that study session. But we don't want to bring all department heads here just in case there's a question. We want to be more respectful of their time and be a little more targeted in that regard. And then at the beginning of March, you will hold the required public hearing, and then after that decision, it will go to the city commission. And keep in mind, the CIP is it's a plan, all right? It's used to help guide the budget process. It's not the only thing that can go in the budget, but more often than not, it includes projects that are called for in the planning documents and or just upgrades and improvements that are needed to our existing infrastructure. So that is where most of that originates from, and I think that's all I have for now.
Are they going to continue with the shorter version of the CIP from last year?
Yes,
Yay.
but maybe even shorter. So for the last few years, we've been using a program called Lucidity, which DPS uses in asset management to manage. It's like a database for the assets that the city owns. Lucidity worked for a while, but there's better products out there as technology has advanced. So we have switched to a company called ClearGov. So we are all kind of learning it now. So there's a bit of a learning curve on our end, but it's much better integrated than Lucidity. So what you put in the CIP automatically goes into the budget, because we're using ClearGov to create our budget, which then automatically connects with BS&A, which is a software we use for accounting purposes. So it's way more integrated than anything was before. And this ClearGov company has a lot more tools built into the web-based platform that we use, such as creating various charts and graphs quite instantly. It has a transparency dashboard. So once we get through entering all this stuff, we'll be able to make it more public-facing in a way that's easier for the public to understand. We'll still probably rely on Jerry and his mapping skills to make that interactive CIP map that helps us, because it doesn't quite have that functionality. But that's kind of an afterthought once the CIP is created. Okay. That's it.
So and I want my other question for people who may not know, and I'm not sure you can speak to it, but what types of projects, what categories are people applying for under that CBDG grant?
There are, we kind of told them what our plan calls for and what the categories are. And one category is projects that address homelessness, and the other is permanent. So most of them hit one of those categories.
Great. Thank you for that. Okay, of course, my screen. Okay, so that takes us to our topic for discussion tonight, continuation of the short-term rental discussion. Who's taking that on?
I'll go ahead and start with
Okay.
that. So first and foremost, I'd like to just thank the staff of the planning department who worked really hard on pulling together all these answers and digging through that data. You guys had this conversation in October. We provided you a kind of a baseline context of what the short-term rental program in the city is to date. And then based on your questions, we were able to seek out those answers as best we can. So we'd like to go through those today with you, allow you to have a discussion. If there's any more direction you want to provide for us, we're here to take that today. And as you see, we only have this one item on the agenda, but we wanted to keep that conversation going. And of course, have Debbie's cookie party. So, so the meeting was held. Actually, Katie was a big advocate for that one too.
I
So
was
she organized. All right, so we'll just kind of go through these questions, and this is, fairly informal, functioning more like a study session, so please ask that you have. So the first question was, how many hospitality units do we currently have? So again, the hospitality units are a use that's allowed in the H1, H2 district. They are intended to provide short-term accommodations for people whose stays are associated with the hospital. Either they're spending the night because they have a procedure in the morning, or they have a family member in the hospital and they want to stay close and things like that. As was presented at the last time that this was discussed, they're not necessarily being used in that fashion, and there's clear evidence to that in the reviews and stuff that people leave. But since they're an allowed use within structures and they don't require a license, we don't have any tracking data on that. So that may be something to consider going forward. It's a district that doesn't allow short-term rentals. It does allow these very specific type of short-term accommodations, but it's not being used that way. So that may be something to consider, whether they need to be licensed or whether or not it's even a use that should continue.
To what extent can that be further regulated or requiring licenses, et cetera, without raising it to the threshold of becoming a taking?
I don't think we'd have to worry about a taking there if you're permitting it. It's usually when you're taking something away that you have a taking. So if you continue to permit it in a more regulated fashion, like requiring a license, I don't think that would be much of a problem.
Your view is we're allowing hospitality houses to have short-term for specific categories of people, and as long as we're ensuring more carefully that that specific category of people is who is staying there, then that is still complying with our existing.
Yeah, potentially. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I was here when we
Yeah,
went
you
through this process. We had somebody come up to us and say that these were operating as short-term rentals in these districts. We knew that it was not an allowed use in those districts. So this was the fast and easy solution for getting for allowing their use to continue because they were very loud about it. That's my personal opinion. Yes. And we had to come up with the definition of a hospitality house, and I think that in the moment it worked. I think in the moment we also knew that it would be really hard to adhere to this. It would be really hard to enforce. And we just thought that was the best we could do at that time. I feel differently now that the city is pretty much, with the exception of residential districts, saturated with short-term rentals. It feels like a clear misuse in that district. So I would lean on the side of requiring a license for a hospitality house. If it's not that big of a lift and it's not considered like a taking, like we were just talking about, I would lean that way, because then there's some sort of required proof instead of just kind of allowing this to continue, knowing that it's not an allowed use.
And would that license specifically be for a unit that's only used for hospital visitors? I mean, is that how it would be defined?
That is something that would need to probably be still explored further. I can't really answer that yet, but if that's the intention or the direction provided by the Planning Commission, that's what we would look into.
I do think that, I don't know if they have a similar thing like this in Grand Rapids, like right downtown near a couple of the hospitals. So maybe they have a definition, or maybe they have it in their zoning code, because I think that's a good place to look. or maybe even Ann Arbor probably has one.
Okay. Good tip, thank you. We will look into that.
Okay. Any other questions on this first one? Okay, let's keep going.
All right, so then the next one is, what kinds of controls and restrictions are available under a police power ordinance? So I think what's important there is to delineate between a zoning ordinance and a police power ordinance. So a zoning ordinance regulates land uses. This includes both the actual use type and the dimensions of things like setbacks, building heights, lot widths, things of that nature. Police power ordinances typically are the ones that regulate activities, nuisances, and/or license requirements. So it's pretty broad there. What communities have to be careful about is the Zoning Enabling Act spells out how land use is to be regulated in the zoning ordinance and the process for changing that, which is different for amending a police power ordinance. You don't have the public hearing requirement and things like that. And so communities have gotten in trouble where they've instituted police power ordinances that were really regulating land uses without going through the actual zoning ordinance amendment process, and then legally it can be disqualified and things like that. So the where, the intensity of the use oftentimes are appropriate in the zoning ordinance. The other things such as a requirement for a fire inspection, the license, things like that, that's where you would put that in the police power ordinance, and that's how that would be regulated.
Do any of the examples that are listed here apply to our current short-term rental situation in the city? Do we have any police power ordinances that regulate short-term rental?
Yep, we have, that's included in your packet, I believe. It's at the end, we have 2 police power ordinances, one for vacation home rentals, that's chapter 870, and the other one is for tourist homes, which are regulated slightly different, so that's chapter 868. So
Right,
those are
and I
included
read.
in there. So the topics that they talk about for vacation homes, that a license is required, it talks about when the effective date was, what needs to be included on the application for a license, the conditions that need to be met in order for the clerk's office to issue a license, some other limitations, such as the notice of the license. It establishes what the fee will be. It talks about the inspections, as well as the municipal civil infraction for violating the police power ordinance, as well as suspension, revocation, and appeals. So that's pretty much a fairly standard structure to how a chapter in a police power ordinance is constructed. It might start with definitions sometimes, and then talk about the requirements, the standards, and then usually the violations, and then the repeal. So that is in there, so you can take a look at it. Remember, we don't have the ability to change police power ordinances, but if there are changes that you think are appropriate based on the zoning recommendations you're providing to the city commission, then it's worth noting that and including it for consideration. And I noticed from the last discussion, there was some talk about that, because one thing we talked about is the license has to be renewed every year. That actually puts a pretty big burden on the clerk's office. I mean, they got to process, almost 600 applications every year, right in the midst of the fall election. So it's a challenge for them. And so maybe that's a question for the planning commission to consider. Is there enough change occurring on an annual basis to warrant a renewal annually? Some communities do 3 years. And I think we have other things that we do a 3-year revolving inspection and kind of renewal on. One would be our multifamily properties. Anything with 3 or more units gets inspected under our rental ordinance for safety, but we do that every 3 years. So therefore, it's kind of a rotating schedule and easier to manage for staff as well. And so far, it's been working out.
So if our objective is to sort of wrap our arms around and perhaps find effective ways to limit further growth of short-term rentals, and we were interested in, requiring that all owners be domiciled in Traverse City, or setting a cap for how many short-term rental properties could be owned by a single, something like that, Mitch and I could initiate at the city commission level, or if there was concurrence in the planning commission, we could bubble that up to
Yeah.
City commission? Either way is acceptable?
Yeah, I think the best way would be to have the planning commission look at all of this in
Yeah.
totality and really kind of, you know, do a comprehensive recommendation. But yeah, then you guys could initiate the police power component with the city commission. And I could convey that in a memo too to support those efforts. But I would encourage, you know, I think we'll get a better outcome if the planning commission thinks about this holistically and makes a set of recommendations instead of one body doing the zoning part, one doing the police
Agreed.
PowerPoint. I think it might get a little
Thank you.
disjointed, and the intent may be missed at times. So, yeah. Any other
Kind
questions?
of, but.
I'll say it.
Well, the only thought I had was, so this kind of addresses the required inspections part. But it, and I might have just missed it in the conversation, but could you require an inspection when you're also requiring license renewal? Is that something that could be done through a police power? We just haven't done it yet?
I think so they need the initial inspection. So Katie used to work in the clerk's office and manage this, so she's actually much,
Yeah, it
Better
is,
to speak to
how
it.
we have it now is just their fire inspections. And, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, because I think there is just one at the beginning and then they're never re-inspected, or there was some sort of additional inspection that didn't happen.
The fire inspections happen every 2 or 3 years. They actually
Okay.
do keep happening, but that is also a lot of work for the fire department as well, even though it is only, every 2 or 3 years, just because it's not even how many came on in a year, so that cycle is a little bit goofy, but it is a lot of like scheduling back and forth with the fire marshal and the people, and these people live out of town, a lot of them. But that does happen, but it can take a long time. I know at one point the fire marshal was backed up for months.
Yeah, I was mostly just trying to think of a way that keeps these buildings super safe, because as we get down further, we
fire.
know how vacant they are for so much of the year. That I was just trying to think of a way to work around that, but I understand that it's probably just causing a bog.
Yeah, I guess it depends too on what you mean by safe, because the fire inspections look at very specific things, but then, they can only do so much. So there has been talk over the years of like, should this be a different kind of inspection, or should there be fire inspections, but maybe other years there are more like code-based inspections of like,
Yeah.
and are they,
I think that's what I was meaning,
Yeah.
that I was getting at.
Yes, so we don't currently do that, of course. That would be something that we'd have to figure out.
Yeah, that's an important point, I think.
yeah. I think, Jackie, you brought up the point about, maybe they have to live here in Michigan, or live here in the city. The legality that we'd have to look into about that requirement, but like when I was working in Acme, that was a big concern when they were doing their short-term rentals, is a lot of the property owners don't live around here. So a condition of getting a license when they did move forward with it was you had to have a designated representative who would sign an affidavit that would say, yes, I will be available to respond to anything within 30 minutes. And they had to have that identified. And the township made it that you had to provide the contact information either on the front door or within 2 feet of the front door. So if there was a problem going on, a neighbor could go and see who I can contact and stuff like that. Now, we don't allow them in our residential areas, which by its very nature, these tend to be smaller units that are rented. Like when you look at like a Long Lake and stuff like that, where Leslie used to work, where you have these big lake houses that might have 10 bedrooms and you have big crowds, those tend to be more of a nuisance to neighbors than smaller units. So it may not be relevant in this community, but for Acme, that was a solution that fit them. So, all right, moving through the list. Were there any other questions on that one? All right, so the next one, how many STR violations does the city see annually? So this last year, we went through, and we used our intern quite a bit on this, but we found 44 violations that we had sent letters to. So just to review the act of code enforcement, typically Well, the goal is compliance, as we've talked about before, trying to get people into compliance. If you don't warn them and inform them of the violation first and just write a ticket, more often than not, the magistrate just throws it out. So we try to bring people into compliance by informing them on this. So most of those letters that are sent out are initial, hey, it appears you're operating a short-term rental, that is not allowed in this district, or if it is allowed in the district, you don't have a license, which is a requirement, so therefore you need to start watching that. And then we flag that, and then we keep an eye on it to see, are they coming into compliance? And if they're not, and they book another stay or something like that, then they get a ticket. So that resulted in 6 getting tickets. Now, one of the things that's kind of hard out there with the short-term rental market is there are plenty of postings that have been identified by the company that we use where they're like ghost postings out there. So they're not actually taking bookings. In some cases, the previous homeowner, in fact, tried to get away with it, and they've since moved, and we can verify on assessing, yep, you did buy that house last year, and things like that. So we put a note in the database that this is not actually an active one, and we can go in and try to book, and then we can find out whether or not it's accepting it or not. So when we do see those numbers out there, just know that some of those numbers include these ghost listings that aren't actual listings. The other thing is when we find ones in the database that aren't licensed, but they're advertising, we'll go in, and oftentimes they are doing 30 days or more. They're just using the Airbnb or Viva. And then we'll even go around and try to book, and if you try to book for less than 30 days, it'll flag and say, nope, 38-day minimum. Or Airbnb, I think they set theirs to 28, because that's an even 4 days, and we give people grace. Like if you're setting it to 28, you're trying to be as compliant as you can with the technology there. But we have other ones too that are out there on 6 different sites that they're advertising on. So it's a lot to watch, and they get tricky and things like that. So I guess long story short, it's a cat and mouse game. We're always playing it with people. They're always trying to be crafty and get around it. But we do the best with the tools that we have.
Is there any way to say our enforcement activity is going up or going down? I mean,
yeah, I mean,
any
I would
trends?
definitely say I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I would say in the last probably 3 years it's gone up just with this tool, because the key part about this tool is they use analysts to identify the location of where the short-term rental is, and that's the hardest part. Like, sure, we can see a bunch of them are advertised in Traverse City, but where? And then, because you got to find where to violate them, or to move forward with the violation. Yeah, don't violate them.
Just a clarifying question. The 6 tickets were issued. Does that mean 6 tickets for 6 individuals or different properties? Okay,
Different
great.
properties,
Great.
yeah.
Not
And-
like 2 of the same.
Yeah, and I was asking the city attorney today, and she had inquired whether or not the people just paid those. And I'm assuming they did. We would have to look into it, because if they don't pay it, they can contest it by an informal hearing. Then our staff, whoever wrote the ticket, is asked to be there. No attorneys. It's just an informal hearing before the magistrate where you pitch your case at both parties. We haven't had that request at all. So I would assume that if they were trying to fight the ticket, that they would kind of move towards that hearing. We haven't been informed.
and is the ticketing process connected in any way to the licensing? I mean, after X number of tickets, points on your license, do you lose your license?
So,
Well,
yeah, that would be in the police power ordinance, which again isn't really our purview, but let me try to look at it real quick in the repeal suspension. See? So the city clerk may immediately suspend the license for cause or non-compliance with this chapter. But,
Suspend. It said suspend, not revoke.
yeah, it goes on, suspensions may be appealed to the city manager, who may overrule or uphold the decision to the city clerk. A license may be revoked by the clerk if, upon the clerk's own investigation, the clerk has reason to believe a vacation home rental has violated provisions of this chapter or any other Traverse City Code or State of Michigan law, has made a false material statement in their application. Now, in most cases, the violations that we're dealing with are properties that aren't even eligible for a license. So there's no license to take away, Most of the people have a financial investment in their licensed one, and they tend to want to play by the rules. They don't want to lose that license. So we don't really have many problems with those.
No, I mean, 2 of the 6 that I know of were definitely houses in residential neighborhoods that were not licensed, will not be licensed.
Is there a fine involved?
Oh, yeah.
Is it hefty? It can't be.
$500 per day per violation.
Yeah.
But that's not something we can change to like up that.
No, and I think there are some laws on that, because it's a municipal civil infraction, it's not a misdemeanor, so there's limits to what the fine can be if it's a civil infraction. In other words, you can't be arrested for it.
Right.
And things like that. Now, some communities, I'd say probably 8 years ago, 10 years ago, when this was becoming more problematic in the area and they were starting to regulate them, would sometimes have a scaled fee for violations. Like your first offense is $500, your next offense is $1,500, because part of it is, and I've talked to you guys before, I mean, it takes a lot of staff time to locate these, to find these. We're paying a lot of money, 23 grand a year for this software to find, like, there's a cost with enforcement. And we don't do enforcement to make money. We lose money, in fact, on everything we enforce. But, who should be fitting that bill? All the compliant taxpayers, or maybe the one who's violating the rules?
And
That's
just
a philosophical question for the commission.
a note with that too is, the person that is getting fined isn't all, in the 2 cases that I know of, it was
A property manager.
a property manager. Different people owned the home. 2 different people who don't even, well, one doesn't live here, but it was a different company managing the property that was probably, then it's like, where does that go? Who was doing the wrong thing? It's just a funny gray area and to track down this stuff.
But if we wanted to do a sliding scale fine like that, that's not, is that something the city commission could do? Could change?
Yeah, all fees and fines and all that get approved by the city commission. So, I mean, again, that's a case where you could make a recommendation. I would want to check with the city attorney on what the limits are as a municipal civil infraction as to what can occur there. Jackie's correct. Every day a violation occurs is considered a new and distinct violation. So you can get that $500 a day. More often than not, and in fact, I don't know if I can think of a time where the magistrates upheld the same, or the amount assessed for the violation. It's almost always reduced. And then at the end of the day, the city gets a third of that. The courts get another third, and then I don't even know where the other third goes. We don't even get all that money that gets assessed.
Probably the state.
Probably the state, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
I have a
So,
question.
yeah, you can look
Oh.
into those
Jerry?
attached chapters, Jerry.
With like PREs and stuff, like primary residence, I mean, is there any way to like escalate it where I don't know the terms of it, but if someone's renting out their, they're not living at that house and they're using it as like it's essentially a home. Yeah, I just didn't know if like, can we not threaten them, but can you escalate it to saying, well, this isn't your primary residence anymore because you're just using this as a commercial venture, and because that changes their taxes.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And that's ultimately up to the assessor, I think,
Oh,
to
okay.
make that call. But yeah, they look at that. Assessors I worked with have taken away the PRE for people that have, there's evidence that, 30 days of this month, you had, or this year, you rented out, you're not clearly living there.
But that's-
There is something in the IRS tax code about if you rent your house more than 14 days, you have to start claiming, it becomes commercial, you gotta claim taxes on it and things like that.
But I would assume that's also probably hard to track too, or
It
you
is.
know.
Yeah, and that's one of those questions we'll get into a little bit later on where we have gaps in the data. But there's a conversation occurring out there right now too, with Traverse City Light and Power. Short-term rentals are considered a commercial use. Commercial uses in the city pay commercial electric rates. They should maybe consider
Yeah.
commercial water and sewer rates, right? It's a commercial use.
Right.
That's something that, is kind of beyond our scope, but I think it should be considered for some of these properties. All right, so if there's no more questions on that, so the next one, are there complaints about tourist homes? What are the pluses and minuses to collapsing the 2 tiers of tourist homes? Have properties of tourist homes requested this or weighed in on the issue? So honestly, I don't know that we've ever received a complaint about a tourist home in our department in the almost 4 years I've been there. I think having the owner on site makes a huge difference, which is why, again, we do allow them in the neighborhood. And there's limitations. You know, you can't design your house differently to accommodate that. It's really truly supposed to be renting out a room. We have a little bit of oversight on that because if the work that they're doing requires a building permit, even though we don't do building permits, they will ask us for a land use permit. So basically interior stuff, we don't require a land use permit for. But we can look at the plans and typically we write a note to the building code office saying, you know, no permit needed, but we can look for clues in those plans. They're like, okay, are they trying to modify their house? Do they have a tourist home license? Things like that. Are they trying to sneak in like maybe another kitchen somewhere for the guests? Those are the things that we look for. So speaking, and I think Anna was here at the time when they went through the tourist homes and established that with the night stays. We have the high intensity and the low intensity. You know, collapsing these was actually a recommendation from the mayor, and one that I really stand behind because as a practice, I don't like having regulations on the books that we can't really enforce. That's mixed messaging to the public, you know. To the question, have proprietors of tourist homes requested this? So that would be a high intensity one. And maybe, or there was a question somewhere I thought that was asked about, have they been denied ever? Because there's a 1,000-foot spacing between high intensity ones. To my knowledge, we
That was Brian's email.
Yeah, that's right, he asked that.
I would say that there have been people who want to do high intensity that haven't been able to.
Because they're within. That's really more for the clerks because we don't issue the actual license on that. They might ask Dave where ones are located and things like that. But at the end of the day, we don't really have a way to enforce it. The spacing, the 2 tiers and then the spacing of the higher tier wasn't to necessarily prevent nuisance issues because the spacing isn't going to prevent it, but to prevent the concentration of potentially nuisance issues. And I just frankly don't feel it's necessary because we've had probably 5 years where we haven't had any complaints about them. So do we need to still have this 2-tier system where some people are maybe getting denied when really those nuisance fears that people had haven't really materialized? And is it a good practice to have regulations that we can't really enforce? Because how do you enforce it? There's supposed to be a logbook. Well, I can fill out a logbook all day long, you know, or tell my guests not to fill it out if I have a low intensity one, or just not make it available, right? The guests don't know that they're supposed to sign a logbook or not. And so it's just one of those things where I think it can become a little problematic for individuals.
Has there been any growth in the number of tourist homes since this was all structured? I mean, I was struck by how few there are, 38 versus 500 plus short-term rentals. Do we need
Jerry
this?
maps them.
I remember once before we did the intensity, so like you couldn't have one within 1,000 feet of each other, and then once we allowed the low intensity, we added maybe like 5 or 6, but then it's pretty much just stayed. I think we're at like almost under 40, but yeah, for a while there, really it's not gone up a whole lot, especially compared to the vacation homes.
Are there downsides to just grandfathering in the ones that are here, and you know, what are the downsides, I guess?
For the life of me, I can't even remember why we created those separate densities. I don't remember what problem we were solving for.
Well, and I remember, I wasn't working here at the time, but just watching, you know, and I think there was a lot of public sentiment that, you know, with these tourist homes, there's going to be, you know, more cars and parking and noise and things like that. And we're like, okay, well, that might be possible with these higher intensity ones that are occurring more often throughout the calendar year. So let's add a space to those between them. But again, that hasn't really materialized. And I just scratch my head. 84 night stays a year is the threshold between the two, where that number came from, and you know, like how we manage that. And so it's like if we're sitting here and we're looking at regulations that no one can even understand why they exist, like do we need them? You know, it's just one of those things to consider as we move forward. So we'll take your direction on that, but that's just a thing that we're throwing out.
Yeah, because I don't know just looking at this map, I don't know how many more high intensity there really could be.
Yeah.
It's not a lot.
And we only allow them, that's the other thing too, is we only allow tourist homes and single-family homes.
Right.
So, you know, there's a lot of places in the city where the dwelling units aren't eligible because they're not that type of residence. They're not a single-family home. So,
And you can't have an ADU, because we just went around with that couple that came in
Mhm.
that do have a tourist home, and then they were talking about building an ADU, and we're like, but then if you do that, then you can't have your tourist home. And they're like, well, could the tourist home be in the ADU? And it's a no.
No.
So it is a funny thing. You know, they were nice about it, but it does, yeah, some people just can't have one.
You know,
What if they did a condo split and the ADU was a separate platted unit?
boy, that would be something to consider.
Yeah, they didn't have enough, their property was really small, so we didn't get
Yeah.
to that part.
One of the things, though, that struck me about the tourist home was the idea of it being hosted, you know, a host on premise, always. And when you look at the marketing that's going on in the short-term rentals, the Airbnbs and the VRBOs, it does seem that they're trying to differentiate themselves to a certain extent by hosted versus unhosted. And I don't know if, as we're looking at regulations, whether that framing of the issue, you know, whether hosted short-term rentals were subject to slightly different regulations, or if we're looking at police power ordinances, whether they might be applied differently in those two situations.
The market has been very dynamic over the last 5 years. We had a pandemic. We had a proliferation, even besides the change in lodging accommodations, of short-term rentals, just their sheer availability and the ability of people to find them. And now we are seeing a transition that, yes, people still will stay in bed and breakfast, people still stay in hotels. Some people will seek out short-term rentals, but not at the rate that they did 3 years ago.
And a lot of that 3 years ago was driven by personal safety. People wanted to be isolated from strangers, transmission of disease that was going on at the time. That was driving a lot of that. Brian made a comment at the last meeting that I've heard from other realtors is that, yes, the short-term rental market is, in this area, kind of taking a little bit of a dive, except for unique experiences. You know, people seem to be drawn, that sector is still going pretty strong, as I understand
If
it.
you have a lakefront house with
Something
a
like
private
that.
yard,
Yeah.
Charge premium money for it. I mean, I'm just curious, these tourist homes, are they being used for tourists, or might they be used for like visiting nurses and who need a place to stay? That kind of thing?
It might be a little bit of,
Well, I mean, they are supposed to be regulated by how many nights a year, but again, anything, I mean, over 30 days is just like having a roommate or something, which
Yeah.
we don't regulate. So
Wasn't there a shorter term also for the number of nights per visitor per stay? I mean,
with the
3
high and
or
the low.
7 or, I mean,
Yeah,
it was shorter than.
I thought there was
Yeah.
a limit on, with the tourist homes, maybe a certain limit to how many nights.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
a visiting nurse with a 2-month assignment might not be
But in 1 month,
appropriate
maybe.
for them.
Yeah, they may seek out a different type of accommodation, you know, and like my neighbors, a young couple, split level house, no kids yet, so they have room is the point. And so he's a nurse. And so last year they rented out their downstairs to another traveling nurse for like 6 weeks. Didn't require a license, you know, she didn't have her own kitchen or anything. It wasn't like a second dwelling unit. It's
Yeah,
just
it's
there
just
was
a
a
room.
bathroom and a family room and a bedroom downstairs, and she occupied it and then went on her way. So there is a lot of that. You know, we are kind of the northern Michigan capital of healthcare. The demand for nursing is strong, as we've heard some announcements from Munson, and they'll be importing some nurses and whatnot. So, yeah, we'll see where they go with that. Anything else on that topic before we move to the next question?
Well, I guess my thought on all of that is, when we're looking at regulating, is there a way to change the regulations to accommodate these kind of people?
Which kind is that?
Like visiting nurses who have a 6-week contract or,
Well, and like Katie mentioned, anything over 30 days, a stay over 30 days, none of this applies to, because this is only for stays less than 30 days. That defines short-term rentals. So the nurse stays, they don't have to deal with licensing or the limitations if they're staying for a month or more. They can stay kind of anywhere, so.
but if they're not?
And then your challenges with the IRS and how you treat that
Yeah.
portion of your
True. Yeah,
residence
yeah.
as now a commercial
Yeah.
property, and how you depreciate it and how you report the income
And that is
those
where,
things.
when you look on your tax bill, you know, if you have a PRE of 70%, it might be because you're renting out 30% of your house to someone, and that's why you don't get the full tax credit for that. So, all right. So next question I believe we're on is 5. So what are the total number of dwelling units in the city, broken down by seasonal, year-round, motel, hotel? So, you know, we do the best we can with the data that we can find. So the most recent year of the American Community Survey is 2022 that their data is available, and they have us listed at 8,302 dwelling units. So it would be interesting to compare that number with what assessing has, because that may be a difference. We did this exercise about 3 years ago, and assessing reported about 6,500 units at the time. So we haven't built 2,000 since then, and that year is 2022. So the methodology that American Community Survey is using and what assessing is using has a little bit of discrepancy there.
And where somebody reports as living for the census might not be where they report as living for tax purposes, might not be where they report as living for voting purposes.
Very true. So of those, about 14% are vacant. Now, it's assumed approximately half of them are used as short-term rentals, all right? Because that category with the census of vacant also includes seasonal homes. So not just homes that are on the market, it does include those as well, but homes where someone isn't living long-term. That is counted as a vacant home in this survey. And we know we have lots of those around here too.
So just to be sure I'm understanding the numbers, if we've got this pool of about 1,200 vacant housing units, we're estimating that half of those are short-term and vacation home rentals, and the other half would be seasonally vacant snowbird homes
Second homes or on the market.
or on the market.
Yep,
Thank
those
you.
are the, I think, is there any other classification in there?
Or just vacant,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
not on the market, just vacant.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Like the house across the street from me was, quote, vacant for 5 years, gutted, no one lived there. It was like a project gone bad.
I've got
and-
one on my block too.
Yeah, you know, and so that would be captured in that category. So, and that number, about 600, through this methodology that Leslie looked at, does align quite nicely with the numbers that we have as well, close to 600 short-term rentals. So that methodology proved to be somewhat solid, which we appreciate. I apologize, my computer locks after about 5 seconds. So constantly putting in. Only if our IT wouldn't require such lengthy passwords that need to be changed every 6 months, that'd be great.
Dang.
So then there was the question about hotel rooms that we have in the city, and so we are looking at about 1,071 hotel rooms. I was actually surprised that the number is that high, because we don't really have the hotels as concentrated as you do in like East Bay Township, where it's very obvious that there's lots of
Well,
hotels.
before the Miracle Mile in East Bay developed, we did have Munson Avenue with
Yeah.
a lot of hotels. We have seen many of those hotels transition to either a more long-term motel stay or to apartments or to, there's a vacant nursing home right now.
Yeah, that one,
That was a
Victorian
hotel.
Inn was a hotel, turned
a hotel.
into assisted living, and now it's for sale, I believe, again, vacant. So of that 1,071, we do have about 110 more on deck from the approved Marriott Hotel. And there may be more coming, as you know. I think we've mentioned that the hole in the ground across or next to JNS, originally that developer was looking to put in residential, but couldn't get the incentives from the state that they needed to make the residential work. So they've shifted and now are exploring like a boutique hotel right there. But yeah, I mean, we kind of have them scattered about. You know, we don't have a ton of accommodations downtown. We're seeing some of that gap filled with short-term rentals, frankly, rather than hotels.
Is there data readily available about vacancy rates for the hotel rooms in the city, and whether that trend is up, down? I mean, I know there are so many variables.
So,
Climate related it can be.
yeah, we don't
but
have
just in general.
direct access to that. That would probably have to be procured from TC Tourism. Which isn't always the easiest to get information from. And I don't mean that as a slight, just for you guys, if we go to ask, it may take a while to get that answer. I will say, what's that?
If at all.
If at all. I was speaking with the manager of Hotel Indigo at a meeting earlier in the spring. And at that point, it was probably April, he was noting that things have slowed down a little bit. For instance, at that point in the year, he's like, typically we have every room booked already for Cherry Festival. We're not even near close to no vacancy. He's like, we will get them booked. We might have to offer discounts, or, you know, it might be people making last minute trips and things like that. But the impression I got from him just in that conversation, again, anecdotally, was that, yeah, it's maybe slowed a little bit. And if I remember correctly, I thought the Ticker did an article about a month ago that, you know, it was a little slower summer, not as aggressive as in the past. And some of that could be a reflection of the economy. You know, we very high inflation rates and things like that.
Hotel rooms are expensive.
They are.
Very expensive.
Yeah.
And I'm sure TC Tourism has a high-level view on that, but if you wanted to get it all into the details about stays, that information may be considered proprietary by multiple hotels that wouldn't want to share it with their competitors.
Yeah.
They're paying bed taxes, so somewhere there's got to be.
Yes.
We got to follow the money to
Yes.
find it.
But I'm sure they have wads of data on how many people are staying, how long the average stay is, how far in advance they're booked, et cetera, et cetera.
Maybe they're willing to show that consolidated, but by property. Makes sense.
Yeah, and I don't know if TC Tourism does like an annual report or anything on the.
Yes, they do.
Do they?
They do, yeah.
Okay, and maybe that's what
They
the Ticker
publish a
was.
nice guidebook and everything.
What's that?
They publish a nice guidebook and everything.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, that's something that we can look for more information on and stuff. One thing the last 5 years have maybe indicated to me is, wow, trends can swing rapidly, more rapidly than probably we've seen in years past. I mean, COVID obviously was a wrench that threw things in there, the high inflation, I mean, the cost of materials. We saw some ping-ponging back and forth with some trends in a short period of time there. All right, so the next question was about new construction, especially the multifamily home. What percentage of those are being utilized for short-term rental? That is a great question. So we pulled data going back to 2018. Now, keep in mind the units that have been permitted in the last 3 years are still under construction or waiting to break ground, many of those. And that's worth noting just in general, right? Like, development takes time. It really is a long game. So in 2018, about 50% of the new dwelling units that year that came online were used as short-term rentals. That dipped quite a bit in 2019 when we went down to about 16%. It may have stayed around there, but if you look, it jumped back up in 2020 as the pandemic hit. Now there was a new market demand that wasn't there and wasn't as strong prior to that. And so we saw that, again, getting close to half the multifamily dwelling units that were constructed were used for that purpose. And then it dipped again in 2021. Now, do I think that's a reflection of a waning demand in 2021? Probably not. We know a lot of construction projects were slowing down because they couldn't get the materials they needed. The supply pipeline was hampered. So Just keep that in mind, that there may be other variables besides just market saturation and things like that. So between 2018 and 2021, we had 572 new units, of which 30% of those were short-term rentals. So it varies, as you can see, and some of that just depends on where was a multifamily structure built. If it was in the multifamily district, they can't do short-term rentals. If it was built in the C4 district, they can do 100% short-term rentals. If it was built in C2, only 25% of those. So there's a lot of factors that can kind of mess and skew that
And
data.
just a note too, that the licenses, like I put in there, it's like 2024 short-term rental licenses. So that's like, of those that were built and permitted then, which are licensed now, because it's, you know, again, I mean, there's that lag time, and I can't go back into history, it's, you know.
Yeah.
but-
So out of the 115 multifamily units that were permitted in 2018, today, 55 of those have short-term rental licenses.
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
Because if we recall back in 2015, there wasn't even a license to receive. It wasn't until I think 2018 that we started this program.
sure.
But they became eligible for a license at that point, and so
But there's like a lot of ways. Leslie and I were having a lot of fun with this. There's a lot of ways to look at this data and of the zoning, and then, you know, even some like, you know, some developers, I'm sure some of the time too, it's like they get licensed, then they're busy building it, and so they might be on every other year schedules, you know, just because of how that stuff works. But
We can expect to see these 2022 and 2023 numbers go up significantly over time.
yes.
You know,
Maybe, or-
well, potentially.
Yeah.
You know, it
Yeah.
Well,
depends.
yeah, that's true,
Because
potentially.
we are looking at how many are licensed in today's short-term rental
Yeah.
market
Yeah,
for a building that was built in 21 or 22, 23.
but these are under
Started.
construction now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we'll, you know, just kind of wait and see on that. I will say, supporting the idea that the market is quieting a little bit. I was on a virtual town hall last week with Josh Mills, who's the city superintendent in Frankfurt. And, you know, kind of like us, after the most beautiful place in America award, they really blew up with short-term rentals there. They were a lot like us too, where there was some around, they weren't really regulated, it was kind of a non-issue, but then they were forced to deal with it. And so they went through and did their regulations, and they took the approach, they're a very small community, where they just instituted a total cap on licenses of 120. This was the first year that they didn't hit the cap. So there's more licenses available than the market is even using right now. And so that's just one of our neighboring communities that had some data to support that. Yeah, it's not just us, it's others around too that are starting to see some of that diminishing demand.
One other point about your numbers here, that dramatic fall off from 2022 in terms of units permitted down to 2024. Did you all have any conversation about the contributors to that decline?
Again, I mean, some of that is like, it's just, I mean, like Annika 2 is maybe
Yeah.
in there, and
Are
there's
you talking about just the drop in
The
just
drop
overall
from-
number of
number
Yeah,
of
the
units?
drop in
Yeah.
number of units
Interest
permitted.
rates went
so
up.
We,
Pardon?
Interest rates went
yeah,
up.
so this is not unique to us. When I talk to the planners around, they're seeing a drop in some of their permitting, and I think it's a lot to do with the economy. Interest rates,
Building costs.
labor,
Building
building
costs.
costs, a lot of that diminished it. You know, there was a couple times where by right developments have been caught up in lawsuits for a couple of years, like that's a sign to developers sometimes, like, maybe we'll meet market demand in another community, because holding a property for 2 years is not cheap. There's a lot of expense for that, so.
But
When-
Morgan Farms is a significant portion of the 22, 23, 24, I
Yep.
would say.
I would agree too.
okay.
So there's a total of, I think, 211 multifamily units at Morgan Farms they've been coming in and getting their permits for each building and building them as they go. So that's one development that really skews the numbers. And we talked about that too, Mitch. I think you were on the commission when we did the community housing profile. We saw that big jump from like 2019, 2020, up to 21 and 22 on the number of
Yeah.
permitted dwelling units, it only takes a couple multifamily projects to double or triple the numbers from a previous year if you're dealing with only like 115 per year, which is what we were for a while there.
I was gonna say, I think a lot of the 2018 to 2021 were in the C districts. Like, if you walk around just in the Cs, they're all over. Gillis Street, they're just down the road here on State. They like all cropped up. And on like West Front. So I think that's where those numbers come from. And then the other thing I was gonna say was when the land does get tied up in a lawsuit, are we seeing that reflected? In what year would we see that reflected? Is it when ground is broken? Is
The year
it
it was permitted.
permitted? Okay.
Yep.
That's
So,
interesting.
when you
'cause
look
that
in
would-
that
So like
28,
Peninsula Place is still in these numbers, even though
That's what
it's
I was.
dirt.
That's the exact one I was
Correct, yeah.
thinking about.
as
Yeah.
is Anovo's Hall Street development. That was a 2021 approval of, I can't remember, it was in the 70s or 90s, the number of units. So it's reflected in the data as permitted. It doesn't exist yet.
Yeah. So it would be under the units number for 2021, maybe, whatever year it was permitted in. So that would artificially inflate 2021 units, which would then obviously mean that the STR licenses could be a higher proportion of that unit if there's not the actual unit because there's still,
Yeah, we have
breaking
like
ground.
a bunch more comprehensive spreadsheet that I was working on, but we were just kind of finishing it up on Thursday, like
Yeah.
still getting data, and I didn't feel that comfortable like putting that
Yeah.
out there because I was just showing, we just need to look at the numbers again and just like really make sure before we put that in a packet with like addresses
And
and
it's so hard-
zoning and
yeah.
everything.
It's hard to just say it's a certain percentage overall because, there's a whole building that is under a pilot or, there's another circumstance. So do you
Yeah.
just take those out? And the ones that are, not actually built yet or under construction? And once you take all of those out, how meaningful are the other ones, especially if they happen before or after a change in the rules? It's really
Yeah.
hard to reflect what the trends are.
Yeah.
And there's
That
so
makes
much
sense.
fluidity, like every day it can
Totally.
change, so it's all a snapshot. Take it as it is the best data that we can. and
It just makes a lot more sense now that I'm thinking about it as the year it's permitted, not like breaking ground. How would you necessarily know that? But of course, when they're permitted, that even between when they get the first permit for a number of units could change by the time they get some sort of inspection and may have to adjust it down to a different unit amount. So,
Yep. All right, so do we know how often STR units are rented? So this is even more challenging to acquire than the hotel room occupancy because we're not dealing with businesses, we're dealing with 600 different mini businesses, if you will. And so we don't really have a good way. It would be very time consuming, so I guess that's a question of how valuable that data is to you. We could go through each of the ones that is identified in our Granicus database, that's the software we pay for, and then click on their links and see how many reviews they've had, but again, it would take a very long time. So that's where it's like, I
I'm sure
don't know.
each of the
We
listing
might-
platforms have that data, but.
Yeah, I was gonna say, we might be
they have-
more effective at trying to procure that information from reports that Airbnb or VRBO put out. I'll look into it. I don't know what they put out. I know they put out some broad, general ones for like states and things like that. I don't know how granular we can get into it.
Yeah, and if they're saying listings in Traverse City, that could refer to anything. It might not even be specific to Grand Traverse County. It could be just Traverse City as representative of northwestern Michigan.
or of, the 5 zip codes.
Yeah, so, We'll continue to
That's a
keep
tough
digging
one.
around on that, but that just, I wanted you to know,
That's
it's
a
not that we're
real
not
tough
trying,
one.
it's just, it's a hard one.
Maybe we
to-
should figure out how we would use that data before we send you off on that.
Okay, yeah, so in the meantime, we won't go through every record in the database, but we will look for some industry
We
publications.
want you to look at every house and the calendars and every house. Follow.
Please no.
Just as a little aside, Traverse City hotel rooms, we do have an occupancy rate. It got as high as 62% over the year, pre-pandemic, and we're closer to 60% right now. And the U.S. average is about 60. It's very much in line with that, 62%, 63% right now.
Cool. Thank you. All right, next, what is the trigger for non-conforming short-term rentals to be required to come into compliance if zoning rules change? So the non-compliant ones mostly exist as vacation homes in residential areas. And I forget the number we have. It's a handful. I want to say less than 10. These were ones that, I think there's a couple more than that, but definitely under 10. But there's just a handful of them that were grandfathered in because they had been operating, and they are required to get a license to be compliant. Otherwise, they're in violation, even though they're legally non-conforming. But there really isn't much that we can do to make them give that up or to be compliant. To be compliant would be not to operate a short-term rental. And so there are some ways that they can lose it. The short-term rental license that they're allowed to have can be transferable upon sale of the property. So in other words, it's a vested right that can be passed on. However, if the new owner doesn't get a license within 90 days, then they lose that vested right. So they do have a timeline in which they have to comply if they want to keep operating. And again, it really only applies to a handful of properties in the city that are not conforming in that regard. All right, so what is the trigger? That's one we answered. For license holders that become non-conforming under zoning changes, what are some possible incentives? We are very limited on incentives. There's really not much we can do to incentivize them unless we're willing to purchase essentially the value that they'd be giving up. It's when you take that away without that compensation, to Mitch's previous point, that's when you have a taking. But if you allow the legal non-conforming status, which is protected under the law, after a zoning change, then they're really allowed to keep operating. But yeah, the incentives are challenging, that's for sure.
I'm always thinking about property taxes, and I'm thinking about if we have what appears to be a future glut of short-term rentals, which tend to be smaller, not 3-bedroom, 2-bath homes, but smaller units. And we have a shortage of housing for individual singles who are in need of smaller footprint homes. Offering some kind of property tax rebate or incentive for owners who transform their short-term rentals into long-term rentals at rates designed to address a particular percent of median income? I mean, is something like that even, I mean,
So-
it sounds a little like a pilot, but not.
No, you're onto a good point there. So we can only offer tax incentives that have been enabled to us by the state. So we just can't go rogue on taxes. We have to operate within what, I know, silly home rule, where the state gives us our authorities. But there are tools out there that we are trying to get before the Planning Commission and City Commission that the state legislature has enacted that could be an incentive for people to convert their homes into long-term housing as opposed to short-term by providing a tax break. So that would be the Attainable Housing Facilities Act and the Multifamily Facilities Act. So the difference between the two is the attainable housing applies for projects that are 4 or fewer dwelling units, so small-scale projects, and the multifamily is for 5 or more dwelling units. So, a city can develop an ordinance under the rules of the state and the treasury, much like the pilot. Essentially, you create your own ordinance, and it gives a 12-year tax abatement. But there's income qualifications for who you can rent it for. But because you got to keep in mind, people are being almost incentivized if they don't live there. If you own the property and you don't live there, financially it makes way more sense to do a short-term rental. Because if you're not living there, you're paying non-PRE taxes. That's approximately a 40% increase in taxes. And so if you have this higher overhead, which revenue source are you going to pursue? The one that brings in more revenue or the one that brings in less? So we're creating a system almost that's incentivizing short-term rentals. I just had a meeting last Friday with our local state representative about that. Like, maybe the state should be exploring a way to allow PRE for long-term rentals, because that is driving up the cost like crazy. Now, all that non-PRE tax difference goes to the school districts. So the school district lobbying arm is very against any change to this system because it would impact their funding. I get that. But that vacant house that was across the street from me, that when my neighbor bought it and renovated it, he couldn't live there. It was gutted down to studs. And so he didn't have PRE on it. And then he got his tax bill this summer. Oh my gosh, now that he's living there, it was so much more. And he showed it to him like, yeah, well, you have 0% PRE. Go take it to the assessing office. It saved him $6,000 in taxes. So if I was a landlord, that's $500 extra I have to charge in rent just to cover the taxes because I don't live in the property. And it seems weird to me that by its very notion, this only applies to people or properties that aren't providing really residency. So are their kids going to school? Probably not. But we're using those scenarios to pay for it. So it's a very strange system to me that I think is compounding some of these problems with rental rates and things like that. Not much we can do. We can have those conversations with our state representatives to try to plant those seeds, but I would not expect to change, and those are the type of things that take 5 to 10 years on a fast track to get changed.
And
What we really should do is utilize these new tools the state has enabled and bring that into play.
And while we're talking taxes and blue sky thinking, finding a way to have a lodging tax applied to short-term rental
Yes.
bed nights, and then finding a way to have some of the lodging taxes allocated to the local municipality rather than it all going to further tourism funding.
Portion, yeah. No, we did.
Why not dream big?
I talked to Rep. Kofia about that as well, and the concept of impact fees. But that's a conversation for later that we'll discuss.
They do pay the lodging tax.
They're supposed to. Yeah.
Over 7 units in a building.
Yep. But to your point, Jackie, we don't get any of that to help cover infrastructure. All the extra taxes that are paid for non-residential homes go to the school districts, not the infrastructure. So there is a problem there that we need the state to help us fix with some of this, especially for communities like ourselves that are, heavily touristed. Okay, so please provide some case studies. Yep, we went through there. So those are there for your review and edification. I don't know, Leslie, if you had anything you wanted to add on that. I don't really plan to speak it too much. You wanted some other examples. So those are just real high-level summaries of how other communities have done it.
It does kind of run the gamut, I think.
Yeah.
There are lots of different options and ways of doing it. It's hard to change. So it's more likely that you would tweak what you have as opposed to coming up with a new program. And this actually came from Granicus, the company that does our monitoring. So it's kind of, it's from within the industry or whatever that's worth, so it might be a little bit reflective of that. but it was the only thing I could find short of looking at 100 different ordinances and trying to summarize them, so forgive me, I took the easy route.
One example I did that caught my attention was for South Haven with the cap. So they have a 1-to-4 ratio, like rental cap. How does that work? How would they know 1-to-4?
So in many communities, they have a rental ordinance that a lot of times you have to get a license to have a rental. So they have
Oh,
that
long
day.
or short?
Yes.
Ah.
We can't do that. We heard that a lot. You guys heard that going
Yeah.
through the housing stuff. We want
Yeah.
a rental ordinance, but that's the example where, back in the 80s, the city was exploring a property tax bill, or not tax bill, but a property maintenance bill, and a charter amendment was introduced.
Mm.
And so, we talked about that before, and it got approved, so you can't have any ordinance on the design, the rental, any of that for single and two-family homes.
Here,
the city,
in
the
Traverse City.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and so that's, again, we've talked about that where, there's a reason why you don't regulate land use through charter, because now we're in a situation where the public has made it very clear that they would like that,
Yeah.
and we can't address it because it's in the charter. We can't.
This could have solved that problem.
Absolutely.
Could have solved a faction of the problem.
Yeah.
It could help alleviate some of that problem, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yep, and,
So that means we just have fewer options available because of, okay.
Yeah, and those rental ordinances serve a great purpose. They oftentimes make sure that landlords aren't renting unsafe units to people.
Going back to my code enforcement, that
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, and so Mike in our office, code enforcement officer, I'd say that's what the majority of his day is spent doing is the multifamily rental inspections. Even on a 3-year rolling basis, it's most of that job. And the hard part is the coordinating, because you need someone present to let
Yeah.
you in. They often don't live here. It's a lot of that. So
So are you saying to have a cap, we'd have to change that chart?
no, not to have a cap.
To have a ratio.
A ratio
Because you'd
of
need the
short-term
data.
to
Okay, got it,
long-term
got it.
rentals, but we don't.
Or any other way that it's
Monitor
tied to
licensing.
rentals.
Yeah, exactly.
But
And
you
so,
could you do a cap that's just a percentage of all the units, the residential units in the city?
yep, you could do that. Some communities certainly have adopted that, or they, like in Frankfurt, they do just a cap for total, regardless of the number of dwelling units that are there. So yeah, that is an option. I think one thing this reflects as you look through here, and it's across the board how people have regulated. This is why many organizations like the Michigan Association of Planning, the Michigan Municipal League, Michigan Township Association, they have come out in opposition to the proposed bills that would preempt local control over short-term rentals. Because as
Yeah.
you can see, every community has kind of right-fitted the
Yeah.
regulations to their needs in their community. And we want to keep that level of control for our communities across the state.
So East Bay Township, they
Yep.
do have a cap, and trying to think of how it is right now. I think it's that they either haven't hit their cap, or it's that if they change the cap and they're over it, they're just gonna let those fall away by attrition. and
Yeah, they have a moratorium that they have extended a few times. But yeah, they have a cap, and they're hoping to, in 2 specific zoning districts, the area around Arbutus Lake and the area between 3 Mile and city limits, to just have the short-term rentals in those areas filter out.
I suppose another way to approach it, if you wanted to keep a ratio, you could, establish a baseline cap on short-term rental licenses that's calculated based on a share of total dwelling units. And then for each additional land use permit, for each 4 additional land use permits, 1 more short-term rental license becomes available and that they ratchet up in proportion.
Yeah, when we did the 21 or 2022 community housing profile, I guess it would have been in 22, we were at about 4% of our dwelling units were short-term rentals. Out there in mind with that today. So we're at about 600 out of 8,500.
80% or so.
7.
Yeah.
Ooh, an even race. We both won.
Yes.
Again, there's a potential of what is coming of those previously permitted. The land use permit.
Oh, yeah, there could be more coming online too. Yeah.
And what is permitted doesn't mean that that's necessarily the use it's seeing right now or will see for the foreseeable future.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And they're still going to be subject to whatever the rules were. Subject to whatever was in place. Is that true?
Yeah, they would be legally non-conforming, so the ones that exist, besides attrition, like you said, where they give up their license or they convert it to a different use and abandon that legal non-conforming use, they're really allowed to keep existing. Now, we can put some of those systems in place, as we discussed, to incentivize more long-term housing. So yeah, there's ways to explore it. I think Leslie made a very good point, though. It is hard to completely revamp the system once you have it in place. It's probably best to work on tweaking what you have to better fit it. One reason is that it helps minimize that legally non-conforming status. If you can, if you do a full-scale change in how you regulate it, you may end up really turning the apple cart upside down. One thing that popped into my head this weekend, we talked about it Monday, and I talked with Lauren, it will need more exploration, is, in the state of Michigan, inclusionary zoning is illegal. Some states allow it. So an example of inclusionary zoning is you would have a requirement that for, every multifamily building that gets constructed, 10% of the units have to be income qualified, meaning they have to be affordable, making, 80 to 120 AMI, whatever the community decides to have. We're not allowed to do that here in Michigan. But I'm wondering, and Lauren's thinking about this now, she's kind of talking through it with her legal stuff. Is there a way to tie the production of short-term rentals to affordable housing? So in other words, in that building, sure, you can have up to 25% of the units be short-term rental, but for every 1 unit of short-term rental, you have to provide 1 income qualified unit, a 1-to-1 ratio. That may address the problem, because right now we're pursuing this because it's perceived that the short-term rentals are affecting housing availability and affordability. So if you make each one of them directly contribute to the availability and affordability of housing units on an equal ratio, that might balance it a little bit, but when Lauren was here with Benjamin, probably you remember hearing things like rough proportionality, the nexus test, and, some of your eyes glazed over. We noticed that because that's the nature of those type of conversations. But that's what she's trying to explore right now. I'm going to put a call into MAP too, the Michigan Association of Planning, to see if they have any other examples, if anyone's tried something like that.
Would the requirement be in the same development or complex, or the same developer is building X number of short-term rental units in the city, and then they have to build so many units at an affordable threshold in the city?
I mean, that would be determined by the direction of this body. But the first question is to determine the legality of that approach, if it's even on the table. And that's kind of where we are right now. So I told Lauren today, because she leaves Friday, so I'm like, if you happen to find yourself on an 8-hour flight to Germany Friday, kick this around a little bit, see what you can figure out. So I'll come back to you. It might go nowhere, but it's just something that popped into my mind this weekend that I thought was worth it.
But yeah, as you alluded to previously with the hole on Front Street, that, okay, they couldn't get the numbers to pencil out for housing, so they're looking at a hotel. There are parts of our city footprint that are more attractive from a financial standpoint and from real estate prices to have lodging be the primary use, and other places where it's a little more favorable to get housing, so.
Yeah, I mean, if you just look at like the math of it, it's probably not surprising that downtown there's going to be a draw for hotels and higher end condos. Right?
Yeah.
It's the highest property value in the region besides some of the lakefront properties, so it's going to have an equivalent high end use to it almost to make it out. So, yeah, I think there's ways
So,
to do it.
yeah, I'm seeing if you require them to be part of the same development, then a developer might say, hey, I can put in some short-term rentals in this four-story building that I'm building on Front Street or renovating an existing property with ground floor retail. But if I have to set aside this number of affordable units at this threshold, then the numbers don't pencil out. But if I'm able to build those somewhere else in the city, then it might pencil out better.
Yeah, and it might, and we saw this occur at Common Ground without being required, right? Like they have market rate apartments, and they have a handful of income qualified apartments, and those are subsidized by the handful of short-term rentals that they have. So the increase in revenue from the short-term rentals covers the loss of revenue in the subsidized units. So it kind of balances out. So you have like almost 3 different types of dwellings. You got the long-term market rate, the long-term income qualified, and the short-term, all in the building, all kind of mixed use. And in some ways, that's kind of nice. I mean, we, as a nation, have plenty of examples in cities where we concentrated lower-income residential housing, and it wasn't a great outcome, like having more mixed-income communities tend to be a little more resilient and healthy communities. So.
I feel like that is the nicest way I've ever heard redlining described, ever.
I only speak in niceties. I've yet to ever curse. I hear people do it sometimes, though.
Real quick, wasn't there similar scenario here at the TCAPS building where,
Yeah.
but was that was part of the applicant's, I mean, that wasn't a requirement.
It wasn't a requirement.
That was
no.
just how they got,
Yes, they got the brownfield reimbursement.
The brownfield, right.
And that requirement for the housing component, since because I don't think it's part of a brownfield plan, but the reimbursement through brownfield comes with strings that the part they're reimbursing has to be income qualified.
Right.
And so that's why the first floor is, I think, going to be 12 income qualified units.
right.
Second floor is going to be office, and then third floor is going to be 4 market rate condos for
yeah.
ownership. So yeah, I mean, that's another example
We're
of
buying 3 of them.
the 3 of us. We're moving.
Oh, and then you're going to commute via zip line?
It's for the planning department. We need more office space. So, we figured
You need
we'd
to get
deserve
on
the
this deal, Jerry.
high-end penthouse.
Yeah.
Yeah, with community space in it. So,
Sounds funny.
so that's kind of the end of the data that we've been able to acquire so far for you. So at this point, we're kind of in more of a study session mode. I don't know if there's discussion that you guys want to have, if you're at a point where you want to provide us with some direction, if you want to take some time to kick this around and we revisit after the holidays. It's really at your discretion at this point, how you want to start moving forward with that. But at some point, for us to move forward, we would need direction. Again, it doesn't have to come tonight. I know we got a couple people absent, but it may be worth discussing. And of course, we have people in the public too. So turn it over to you.
Director Winter previously mentioned state legislation for regulation of short-term rentals. I mean, this has been certainly a repeating thing that comes up each cycle. Hasn't gone out of the House, but I do think that the proposed language that they had this cycle through the end was good. It did provide a lot of flexibility for local municipalities to find what works well for us. So most of the case studies here would be unchanged or very minor changes under that. The Michigan Municipal League and Association of Planning both pulled out the forces and helped refine those bills, and I personally testified in behalf of that language. However, talking to Representative Andrews of of St. Joseph, his district includes South Haven, I talked to him over the weekend, and he was very disappointed that although they had the requisite number of hearings, more than the requisite number of hearings, because it's an important issue and requires a lot of viewpoints, and had the number of bill readings, it was never scheduled for a vote, thanks to, as near as I and he can tell, the actions of House leadership had, along with a lot of other bills, pigeonholed them, and some of those bills got brought out during lame duck, as we have seen, but that one hasn't come out and is not going to be coming out. So we can hope that that informed language will be what we see going forward, but it is a frustrating struggle.
So what has been asked of us is, how do we want to move forward? Do we want to make suggestions now? Do we want to wait until after the holidays till we have everyone here? If that's the case, then what about this suggestion that we all send in things we'd like to see happen for exploration? Maybe it'll be legal, maybe it won't be legal, maybe it can happen based on these case studies, based on what we know about our city. What do you think about that? Okay, so why don't we do that, like, before the next meeting?
Mm-hmm.
Which is when? January
6th, 7th?
Seventh.
7th? So would you have time with the holidays to send your suggestions in? You guys can compile that, and then let's figure out when to put that on the agenda, and hopefully more people will be here to discuss that. Does that sound good, Jackie?
I was just going to suggest, we have a January study session coming up that was planned for the, report on 2024, and I wonder if we could dedicate some of that time to getting more specific about, what we'd like to see in a package. I think that both the police power side and the land use side should be addressed separately, but in a way that they travel together and complement each other. And maybe we could get the bones of that, start that conversation at that
So
study
that's the
session.
second meeting in January you're talking about?
Yeah,
Yeah.
when
Because
that-
we'll have a pretty full agenda at the first meeting, just with
Okay.
our annual
And then-
beginning of the year
Sure.
stuff.
And Lauren
Sure.
might have to weigh in on some.
But maybe the
Yeah,
study
Lauren
session.
won't be in, she won't get back into town till the 4th. So, and just for your knowledge, I'll be out most of the next 2 weeks myself.
So the date of the January study session that you said was going to have our 2024
Probably would
planning,
be the 21st.
21st, is that a
20th.
reasonable target, or?
I think it's it seems reasonable, at least as a starting point, right? We may decide that we need to come back the next meeting, and, that's the nature of it.
I think it's the 22nd,
Or
because
no, I'm sorry, 21st.
MLK,
21st.
MLK is Monday,
Oh.
so then city will move to the 21st.
Oh.
Wouldn't we bump to the 22nd?
You're correct,
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
that week.
Oh,
we
and that
would be.
reminds me, I did make that calendar, and I think we all approved it
Yeah.
a million times, so I can send that out to you guys.
Yeah, we have the 2025 calendar.
Okay. Well, let's shoot for at least getting our suggestions in, having you look at that, seeing if you need to talk to Lauren about any of it, see if Lauren has to be at that meeting on the 21st, and see what we can tackle. Like you say, it might take several meetings to.
I'm also kind of envisioning the way that Leslie handled the master plan, or the study session in November, where we kind of all agreed to group certain things together and then prioritize certain ones. I feel like that was really efficient, so I think something similar, even though this meeting might just be that collecting of responses.
And we'll just plan for more as we need them. That's okay with everyone? Sound good? Sound good to you guys?
Mm-hmm.
All right. I think that's a great start. Thank you for all this great information.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting to see the different case studies, I thought. Does anybody have any other questions or comments regarding the study session? Is there a public comment regarding our study session? Okay, I see no public comment, so we are adjourned, and you're invited to have cookies.
And if you're here for school, we will sign your documents.
I wonder who that is.
Oh, that was another thing. Josh
It was
like, there
taking
were so
everything
many
in me,
students
because when